Thank you very much, Acting Deputy President. I rise to speak on the Higher Education Support Amendment response to the Australian Universities Accord Interim Report Bill 2023. Very regrettably, this bill comprises a poor and frankly chaotic response to the University Accord Interim Report, which is more about the government being seen to be doing something rather than the Minister for Education, Mr Clare, undertaking cohesive, considered policy reform of the higher education sector, underpinned by evidence-based policy and proper consultation. The Coalition does not support this bill because it removes a vital cost of living safeguard for Australian university students, the 50% pass rule, which protects students who are failing their course from incurring massive student debt with nothing to show for it. This bill also represents bad policy because it includes a rushed and haphazard support for students policy, which does not properly support students, whether it be on holding universities to account for deficient courses, whether it be ensuring that students complete their courses successfully, or whether it be keeping students safe on campus. This policy is a totally inadequate response to the many ways the government needs to be stepping up and holding universities to account for every single aspect of their performance in order to put students first. That is the government's #1 responsibility, Acting Deputy President, to put students first. And this bill does not do this. So, in opposing this bill, I do want to make it clear that the opposition does support the extension of regional university centres, which was an important measure of the opposition when we were in government. The regional university centres are a very, very important part of our support for regional students, one of a raft of many different policies. So I want to turn firstly to the 50% pass rule. Under the Job Ready Graduates program, the Coalition introduced a provision which required students to maintain a pass rate of 50% or above for units of study they undertake. Students who have a low completion rate and do not meet this requirement lose eligibility for Commonwealth assistance, a Commonwealth-supported place, and they must either pay for their course up front, transfer to another course, or withdraw from their studies. The rule commenced on the 1st of January 2022. A low completion rate is when a student has a fail rate of more than 50% of units of study attempted after he or she has attempted 8 or more units of study in a bachelor level or higher course, or 4 or more units in a higher education course lower than a bachelor course. The 50% pass rule was introduced not as a punitive measure, but to protect students from accruing massive HECS debts under circumstances where it's highly likely they will not complete their course, safeguarding students from racking up a massive HECS debt without any university qualification to show for it. And I will take the interjection from Senator Faruqi, because as part of this 50% rule, there are very important special circumstances exemptions. So where a student hits difficulties, whether it be illness, whether it be a death in the family, whether it be some other disadvantage caused by the course provider, whether it be financial difficulties, whether it be changes to employment or any other relevant circumstance, Senator Faruqi, students can go to their university and say, these are my circumstances, the 50% pass rule does not apply to me, but I am now on notice that I do need to make sure that I lift my pass rate to stay in my course, and I would obviously seek this exemption in relation to the rule. So one of the most disappointing aspects about this proposal to abolish the 50% pass rule, a rule that the universities hate because, of course, they lose students potentially and also revenue, and it was a measure that was not supported by and large in the interim report. But one of the most disappointing aspects of this proposal is there is no evidence for it. And we fought very hard for a Senate inquiry and for public hearings, which were initially opposed by the committee, and we had to bring that into the Senate to have that decision overturned so we could have public hearings. And while Mr Clare said in his second reading speech for this bill in the other place, more than 13,000 students at 27 universities have been hit by this in the past 2 years, mostly from disadvantaged backgrounds, we actually know that there is not the data to support that conclusion, because this comes from a Universities Australia survey that they asked not be made public because of its statistical unreliability. And in fact, while they looked at the number of students affected, including those who were at risk of not passing all of their subjects, there is no data to show how many students lost their Commonwealth supported place. So it's very, very disappointing that when we sought that data from the Minister, from the Department of Education, and we wanted the breakdown to look at the 27 universities, what each of them had, by way of their own data, had given to Universities Australia, that information was denied, which is wrong. They are under an obligation to provide that information to the Senate committee. So, and I particularly want to focus on this because Universities Australia, in its survey, very clearly advised that affected students included those who had been put on a restricted study plan or those who were at risk of being affected, so perhaps students who'd failed 30% of the units but had not yet hit the threshold, the 50% pass rule threshold. So this is a very deceptive proposal being put forward, underpinned by very little evidence, and the government's attempts to claim that more than 13,000 students have effectively been hit by this rule. Effectively, the Minister was suggesting that these students have lost their Commonwealth supported place, has no credibility. Also, claims by the government that equity students, including those from disadvantaged or low SES families, were impacted disproportionately was also not borne out in the data that we did receive. For instance, at Curtin University, 1,213 students were affected, which includes students, of course, who were potentially facing the risk of losing their Commonwealth supported place, but only 311 were from equity cohorts, around 25% or 3% of total students. So, of the evidence we have received, this does not support the government's proposition. To make matters worse, the Senate inquiry established there are no requirements on universities to report the number of students who have lost their CSP, and that should be remedied. And unfortunately, this is another example of policy on the run. I also want to briefly mention the horrific cost of living pressures that so many students are facing as a result of Labor's cost of living crisis. So more than 3 million Australians had their student debt increased by 7.1% on the 1st of June this year. So many students can barely pay the rent or the power bill, let alone stay in their course. And the government has done nothing to support students who are in crisis. Last year, the indexation rate was 3.9%. Next year, it's forecast to be around some 6%. So around 16% increase in student debt. And this measure was a vital measure to ensuring that students did not continue to rack up student debt, studying courses or units of study that they were failing and leaving university with nothing but massive debt. So I say shame on the government, because the suggestion that the Support for Students policy is an adequate replacement is totally wrong, and it is not borne out by the evidence. I do want to briefly turn to the Support for Students policy. This is an attempt to patch the glaring hole in student protections for accruing unnecessary help debts, which would result if the 50% pass rule was abolished. At the time of the bill's introduction, there were no details about this policy. It's an absolute shambles, this policy. It sets out, we've just received the guidelines. These are regulations not encompassed in the bill, which of course could be changed or abolished on a whim without parliamentary oversight. The guidelines lack any substance, cohesion or accountability as to how the government and higher education providers will deliver the appropriate support to students to help them succeed in their studies. And in fact, Universities Australia is deeply concerned about this policy on the run. It says it won't achieve the stated policy intent of providing support for students. It will place further reporting requirements on universities, which equates to more red tape and risks diverting resources away from the core aim of supporting students, which universities are already fully committed to doing. There's been no assessment about the regulatory gaps that this policy is seeking to fill. There's been no assessment about the implementation cost. There's been no assessment about whether the universities can even possibly hope to introduce this by the 1st of January. And as Universities Australia has said, they are deeply concerned about the timeline and to expect universities to overhaul their existing systems, or in some cases to develop entirely new ones, which might require the procurement of new IT systems or the upgrade, is just completely unrealistic. And in its statement, it says, "It is our firm view that the guidelines as they stand will create additional regulatory burden for universities without driving better outcomes for students." And I do say, and it looks there was some reference to support for students that need protection from sexual violence and sexual harassment. That looks like it was just tacked on the end. And the really big issues in relation to protecting students on campus, the safety of students, has not been properly addressed at all. And that is a complete disgrace. And then about, less than 2 weeks ago, the minister is scrambling, realising that this is just a shambolic mess, and then he picks up the coalition's proposal that I've prosecuted very strongly over a number of months for a student ombudsman, an independent student ombudsman, someone who will independently hold the universities to account and will give students the right for redress, the right for justice. And that now seems to have been patched together. Apparently that's going to be proposed to education ministers at the next education ministers' meeting. But that, again, reflects the utterly incohesive policy in relation to student support. And if the minister knew what he was doing, where is the student ombudsman proposal? Why wasn't this part of the bill? Why don't we have comprehensive support for students? I mean, this is an example of the minister trying to be seen to be doing something as a result of the university's accord, rather, as I say, than delivering cohesive and properly considered policy underpinned by evidence and proper consultation. I also just want to briefly raise concerns about the extension of demand-driven funding for Indigenous students. There is, very disappointingly, the government has not addressed how universities are going to improve Indigenous completion rates. That is very concerning, and why other equity cohorts have not been included in the expansion of these uncapped places. But as I say, principally, the minister and the government have got this fundamentally wrong, and this bill should be opposed. Thank you.